In the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, the hardware store on Main Street had never seen violence until that fateful Friday evening. Margaret Wilson, a 58-year-old grandmother of 4, had always kept her licensed pistol behind the counter for protection. But 3 weeks ago, a clerical error in the county records office had led to police confiscating her firearm. Tonight, as 5 masked men burst through the front door waving guns and demanding cash, Margaret felt her heart race. Her eyes darted to the display of power tools just 10 feet away. What good would a nail gun be against real firearms? But sometimes, desperation breeds ingenuity. Can an ordinary woman with an extraordinary will to survive turn a simple tool into a weapon of justice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Wilson had called Cedar Ridge home for nearly 40 years. At 58, her chestnut hair now carried generous streaks of silver, and laugh lines framed her observant hazel eyes. 25 years of managing Cedar Ridge hardware had given her hands a certain roughness, but they moved with precision when explaining the difference between wood screws and drywall screws to confused customers. The store had been her sanctuary after Robert passed. 12 years a widow, she'd found purpose in the honest work of helping neighbors solve problems with the right tools and a bit of practical wisdom. The small office behind the register held her most treasured possession, a framed photograph of Robert in his firefighter uniform, taken 3 months before the warehouse collapse that claimed him and 2 others. Beside it sat the now-empty display stand for her Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, a gift from Robert who had insisted she learn to use it properly. Just in case, he'd said. Those words echoed in her mind every time she glanced at the empty stand. The confiscated pistol license lay in her desk drawer, the county seal and red, suspended, stamp a daily reminder of bureaucratic indifference. Sheriff Dan Holloway had apologized profusely when he'd come to take the firearm 3 weeks ago. "It's just procedure, Maggie," he'd explained, using her nickname from high school days. Some mix-up with a Margaret Wilson from Oakdale who had a domestic charge back in '98. "We'll get it sorted." But 3 weeks of phone calls and emails had produced nothing but empty promises and referrals to different departments. Meanwhile, her sense of security had eroded with each passing day. Her modest ranch-style home sat just 6 blocks from the store, close enough to walk in good weather. The walls held photographs charting the growth of her family. Her son Thomas and his wife in Seattle with their 2 boys. Daughter Sarah's family closer in Springfield with twin girls. Sunday dinners remained sacred, with Sarah's family making the 40-minute drive weekly. The grandchildren called her Hammer Grandma for her ability to fix nearly anything. Cedar Ridge itself had changed little over the decades. With just over 12,000 residents, it maintained its small-town character despite the encroachment of chain stores on the outskirts. Main Street still featured the diner, post office, library, and a handful of independent businesses that had weathered economic storms through community loyalty. The hardware store's bell chimed at 8:30 each morning as Margaret unlocked the doors. Regulars like old Pete Jenkins would appear moments later, often more for conversation than purchases. She knew most customers by name, and those she didn't, she made a point to learn. People don't just need the right tool, she often told new employees. They need to know someone cares about their project. This connection to community had sustained the business while 3 other downtown shops had closed in the past 5 years. Cedar Ridge Hardware wasn't just a store. It was an institution where you could find solutions, advice, and a friendly face behind the counter. But that sense of safety had been fractured since the day Dan had walked in, official paperwork in hand, apology written across his weathered face. He'd been 3 years behind her in school, had dated Sarah briefly in high school, and now wore the sheriff's badge with a mix of pride and weariness. Their friendship stretched back decades. "I'll keep an extra patrol car going past during closing," he'd promised, "just until we get your license situation fixed." Those extra patrols had materialized for the first week, then gradually faded as other priorities demanded attention. Margaret had taken to varying her closing routine, depositing cash at irregular times, and keeping the panic button the bank had installed within easy reach. She'd never needed to use any of these precautions in 25 years. Cedar Ridge wasn't the kind of place where violent crime happened. At least, that's what everyone believed. The empty holster beneath the counter seemed to mock that belief every time she reached for receipt tape or a stapler. She'd catch herself glancing at it during quiet moments, a habit formed over years of checking that the revolver was secure. The gesture had become almost superstitious, a ritual that had lost its purpose. "You're being paranoid, Mom," Thomas had said during their weekly phone call. "The odds of anything happening in Cedar Ridge are practically zero." Margaret hoped he was right, but 40 years of living had taught her that statistics offered cold comfort when you found yourself becoming one. Cedar Ridge hardware stood as a testament to permanence in a world of constant change. The brick facade had weathered 73 mid-Atlantic winters since Harold Jenkins hung the original wooden sign in 1952. The brass bell that announced each customer's arrival was the same one Harold had installed, its tone mellowed by decades of use. Margaret had considered replacing it only once, after a particularly harsh winter had cracked the mounting, but Hank Miller, her oldest employee, had repaired it with the reverence one might show a historical artifact. "Some things you just don't replace, Maggie," he'd said, his arthritic hands carefully polishing the brass to a soft glow. The original pine floorboards creaked in specific spots, creating an unintentional security system. Margaret could identify who was walking the aisles by their weight and stride pattern. The wooden counters bore the patina of thousands of transactions, nicks, stains, and worn edges that told the store's history better than any ledger. And the ledger itself was something special. Bound in cracked leather, its pages had recorded the building of Cedar Ridge home by home. Margaret kept it in the glass display case like a museum piece. Inside were the purchases for the town hall renovation of 1963, materials for the high school gymnasium in 1978, and even the special order brass fixtures for Sarah's wedding arch. The ledger wasn't just a business record, it was a community archive. "Found your grandfather in here yesterday," Margaret had told young Jesse Thompson last month, showing him the neat handwriting recording Walter Thompson's purchases for his first home in 1989. "Looks like quality hardware runs in your family." Jesse, at 25, represented the store's future. A business major at the community college, he worked 30 hours weekly between classes. His quick mind absorbed inventory details and pricing structures while his easy charm made him popular with customers. Margaret had been quietly grooming him as her eventual successor. "Ms. Wilson," he'd asked recently, "have you thought about expanding our online presence? I could set up a system for local contractors to place orders for pickup." She'd agreed, though the computer in the back office intimidated her more than she cared to admit. The digital world felt foreign compared to the tangible reality of the store. Fran Decker handled the bookkeeping with old-school precision. At 62, the former math teacher had taken the part-time position after retirement and brought order to the filing system. Her immaculate purple sweaters and precise speech provided a counterpoint to the practical messiness of hardware retail. "Margaret, the quarterly tax estimates are complete," she'd announce with satisfaction, presenting folders with color-coded tabs. "And I've noted the Phillips account needs attention." Together with Hank Miller, who at 70 still worked 3 days weekly sharing his lifetime of construction knowledge, they formed the core team that kept Cedar Ridge hardware functioning as both business and community institution. The store's layout had evolved organically over decades. The front section housed everyday items: light bulbs, batteries, small tools, and household hardware. The middle section contained plumbing and electrical supplies, organized by project type rather than strict categorization. The back held building materials, lumber, and larger equipment. The power tool display occupied the prominent right wall, visible from the entrance. Each morning at precisely 8:25, Margaret walked the aisles, straightening displays and mentally noting stock levels. This ritual connected her to the store, like a captain inspecting her ship before sailing. She knew the inventory intimately: 47 types of screws, 32 varieties of nails, 18 different caulks for specific applications. This knowledge had earned the community's trust. That trust manifested in the morning gatherings of contractors at the worn wooden counter, where coffee brewed by 8:45 and conversation flowed freely. They discussed jobs, shared techniques, and occasionally settled disputes through Margaret's gentle arbitration. The coffee wasn't particularly good, but the camaraderie was essential. These gatherings had dwindled somewhat as the big box home improvement store had opened on the highway 15 miles away. The impact was undeniable, a 22% revenue decline over 3 years. Margaret had responded by emphasizing personal service and expertise rather than competing on price. "They sell products," she told Jesse. "We sell solutions." Still, the financial pressure remained a constant concern. The store's ledger, for all its historical significance, told a story of tightening margins and increasing challenges. Each month required careful management to maintain both inventory and payroll. Margaret had foregone her own salary twice this year to ensure Hank, Fran, and Jesse received theirs. The store had survived previous challenges, the recession of 2008, the flood of 2011, and the highway construction that had diverted traffic for 11 months in 2019. Margaret believed it would survive this too, though survival required constant vigilance and adaptation. Much like personal safety in a changing world. The morning Sheriff Dan Holloway arrived at the hardware store with official paperwork tucked under his arm. Margaret had been explaining the merits of various wood stains to Mrs. Peterson. Dan's expression, a mixture of official resolve and personal discomfort, had immediately told her something was wrong. "Got a minute, Maggie?" he'd asked, nodding toward the office. The county form lay between them now on her desk, its official letterhead and multiple checkboxes presenting an indifferent face to the human consequence it represented. "Notice of firearms license suspension and confiscation order." Read the bold header, with Margaret's name, address, and license number filled in the appropriate spaces. "There's been some kind of mistake," Margaret said, studying the form. Her fingers stopped at a line midway down the page. "Prior conviction. Domestic disturbance? Oakdale County. 1998. "I've never been to Oakdale County in my life, Dan." The sheriff nodded. "I know that, and you know that. But the state database doesn't know that. They've got you mixed up with another Margaret Wilson. Can't you just tell them it's not me?" Dan sighed, removing his hat and placing it on the desk. "It's not that simple. Once you're flagged in the system, there's a procedure. I have to confiscate the firearm until it's cleared up. But that's ridiculous. I've had this license for 15 years without a single issue." "I know, Maggie, and I'll help you straighten it out. But for now." He gestured toward the revolver she kept beneath the counter. The unfairness stung, but Margaret recognized the expression on Dan's face. He wasn't enjoying this any more than she was. With reluctant movements, she retrieved her .38 special, carefully unloaded it, and placed both the weapon and ammunition on the desk. "How long will this take to fix?" "Shouldn't be more than a few days," Dan had said. "A week at most." That had been 3 weeks ago. The error-filled county records form lay in Margaret's desk drawer now, wrinkled from repeated handling as she'd made call after fruitless call. The first week, she'd been optimistic, methodically working through the suggested channels. The county clerk's office had directed her to the state licensing division, who referred her to records verification, who suggested she file an identity dispute form with vital records. Each conversation began with explaining the situation anew. Each transfer dropped important context, and each promised follow-up failed to materialize. By the second week, frustration had set in. Margaret had spent her lunch hours on hold, listening to the same 30-second music loop while watching customers through her office window, unable to help them. "I don't understand why this is so difficult," she'd told Dan during his follow-up visit. "Surely they can see I'm not the same Margaret Wilson from Oakdale. Bureaucracy moves at its own pace," he'd replied with a sympathetic shrug. "The woman handling your case is out on medical leave, and apparently, nobody else can access her files." The absurdity might have been comical if it hadn't left her feeling so vulnerable. The hardware store had never been robbed in her 25 years, but the knowledge that her means of protection was locked in the sheriff's office evidence room created a persistent unease. Margaret had considered purchasing another firearm but dismissed the idea. Her license was suspended, and she wouldn't break the law, even to address an injustice created by the law itself. Instead, she'd adjusted her routines. The bank deposits, once predictably made at closing each day, now varied. Sometimes Jesse would take the money during his afternoon break. Other days, Margaret would close briefly during lunch for a quick trip to the night deposit box. She'd installed a second panic button beneath the register and made sure all employees knew the silent alarm procedure. "Isn't this a bit much?" Fran had asked after the third security meeting. "Nothing's happened in Cedar Ridge for years." "Probably," Margaret had admitted. "But I'd rather be paranoid than unprepared." The weekly county commissioner meeting had yielded no better results. Margaret had presented her case during the public comment period, only to be told that firearms licensing was a state matter outside local jurisdiction. Commissioner Taylor had promised to make a call, but nothing had come of it. "The system's designed to prevent the wrong people from having guns," Dan had explained. "Problem is, it sometimes catches the right people too." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She'd done everything by the book, taken the safety courses, practiced regularly at the range, kept her licensing current, only to have that responsibility nullified by a clerical error. Last week, she'd spotted two unfamiliar men entering the bank as she made her deposit. Their eyes had lingered on her canvas bag a moment too long, and she'd felt the absence of her revolver with acute awareness. Nothing had happened, but the incident reinforced her growing sense that the world had somehow become more threatening. Or perhaps it was simply that she had become more vulnerable. Each evening when she locked the store, the final check beneath the counter had become a habit she couldn't break, her fingers finding only empty space where reassurance had once lived. Thursday began like any other day at Cedar Ridge Hardware. Margaret arrived at 8:15, 15 minutes before opening, to find Hank already waiting by the back door, thermos in hand. His arthritis was particularly troublesome in the autumn dampness, but he'd never missed a scheduled shift. "Morning, Maggie," he said, following her inside. "Going to be a busy one. Johnson's crew is starting that renovation on Maple Street today." The morning unfolded with comfortable predictability. The contractor crowd arrived shortly after opening, filling their thermoses from the coffee pot while discussing the day's projects. Margaret moved among them, answering questions about load-bearing requirements and suggesting alternative materials for a porch restoration. By 10, the initial rush had subsided, leaving Hank explaining water heater installations to a young couple while Margaret restocked the fastener bins. The brass bell above the door announced another customer, and she glanced up with her customary greeting ready. Two men entered, unfamiliar faces in a town where she knew most everyone. The taller one wore a baseball cap pulled low, while his companion sported a leather jacket despite the mild weather. Something in their body language, too casual, too studied, triggered Margaret's instincts. "Good morning," she called from behind the counter. "Anything I can help you find today?" "Just browsing," the taller one replied, not quite meeting her eyes. They moved toward the electrical section, speaking quietly. Margaret busied herself with paperwork, keeping them in her peripheral vision. Their browsing patterns seemed aimless, with more attention paid to the store layout than to the merchandise. The shorter man lingered near the register, studying the counter setup with unusual interest. "You folks close at 6? He asked suddenly. 6 Monday through Thursday," Margaret replied. 8 on Friday for the weekend project crowd. "Must be busy Fridays then," the taller man commented, joining his companion. "Probably handle a lot of cash those days." The question struck Margaret as odd. Most customers didn't think about a store's cash flow. "We take cards too," she answered non-committally. "Can I help you find something specific?" "Nah, just getting the lay of the land. Might be doing some work around here soon." They left without making a purchase, the bell signaling their departure. Margaret watched through the window as they climbed into a dark sedan with out-of-county plates. "Those two seem off to you?" she asked Hank when he approached the counter. "City folks," he replied with the dismissive tone of a lifelong small-town resident. "Always look like they're up to something." Margaret might have dismissed her unease if not for the security camera footage she reviewed during her lunch break. The store's modest surveillance system, installed after a series of shoplifting incidents 3 years prior, captured the men's movements from 4 angles, What struck her now was their systematic examination of the store's layout. Noting the location of the stockroom door, studying the ceiling corners where cameras were mounted, testing the weight of the counter gate. These weren't the actions of potential customers. They were casing the store. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. "Dan, it's Maggie. I had some suspicious characters in the store today." She described the men and their behavior, then explained what she'd seen on the security footage. "Could be nothing," Dan replied, though his tone suggested he was taking her seriously. "But I'll have a deputy swing by a few extra times tomorrow, especially around closing." Got a description of their vehicle. She provided what details she could recall. "I'm probably overreacting," she admitted. "Better safe than sorry. You still doing the night deposit tomorrow?" "Yes. Friday's our busiest day for cash sales. I'll try to have someone nearby during that time. And Maggie, still working on your license situation. Should have news soon." After hanging up, Margaret made two decisions. First, she asked Jesse to stay late tomorrow to help with closing. Second, she moved most of the cash from the safe to the bank during her afternoon break, leaving only enough to make change. The remainder of Thursday passed without incident. As closing time approached, Margaret found herself in the tool section, conducting inventory. The display of pneumatic nail guns caught her attention, their bright yellow housing designed to attract DIY enthusiasts. She picked up the floor model, testing its weight and balance. The DeWalt 20V Max powered straight through 3-inch framing nails with ease when properly charged. Margaret returned it to the display, making a mental note to order more 16-gauge nails, which had been selling well to the Maple Street renovation crew. As she locked the front door at 6:05, Margaret scanned the street with heightened awareness. No sign of the dark sedan, no suspicious figures lingering nearby. Just the usual Thursday evening quiet of Cedar Ridge's Main Street. "You're letting your imagination run wild," she told herself, setting the alarm. Still, she double-checked every window and door before leaving, and took a different route home than usual. That night, Margaret dreamt of her late husband. In the dream, Robert stood in the hardware store, still wearing his firefighter's uniform. He said nothing, but kept pointing to the tool section with unusual urgency. She woke at 3:17 a.m., the dream fading but the unease lingering. Tomorrow was Friday, the busiest day of the week, the day when the cash register would contain the most money. Margaret stared at the ceiling, willing herself back to sleep, trying to ignore the whisper of intuition that something was about to change. Room 17 of the Pineview Motel sat 5 miles outside Cedar Ridge town limits. The establishment had seen better days. Water stains mottled the ceiling. The carpet bore cigarette burns despite the prominent, no smoking signs, and the air conditioner rattled asthmatically in the window. None of this concerned the 5 men gathered inside. Vince Corelli spread a hand-drawn map across the stained bedspread. At 36, he projected authority through sheer intensity. His close-cropped dark hair and perpetual 5 o'clock shadow gave him a predatory appearance, enhanced by eyes that never quite settled. "All right, one more time," he said, tapping the crude floor plan of Cedar Ridge hardware. "Cole and Carson, you're in the car. Standard setup, Carson drives, Cole watches the scanners. Any police chatter, you give us the abort signal." The twins nodded in unison. At 28, they were the youngest of the crew. Nearly identical with sandy hair and lanky builds, they finished each other's sentences and shared a detached effect that unnerved even their associates. "We'll be 2 blocks north," Carson said. "Clear sight line to the front door. Engine running," Cole added. "Scanner tuned to local police frequencies." Vince turned to a heavyset man sprawled in the room's only armchair. "Darius, you're with me through the front. Immediate control of anyone inside. Should just be the old lady at closing time." Darius Phillips absently flexed hands the size of baseball mitts. At 42, he was the oldest, with a record that included 2 stints in state prison for assault and armed robbery. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, pulling his features into a permanent sneer. "Old ladies don't cause problems," he rumbled, "especially when looking down the barrel." Ray Meeks, perched nervously on a chair by the window, kept glancing outside as if expecting police to arrive any moment. Rail-thin with darting eyes, the 33-year-old's jittery demeanor belied his role as lookout. "What if there's customers?" he asked. "Thursday, that place was crawling with people." "We're going in at 7:55, Vince replied. 5 minutes before closing. Place should be empty. But if not, we adjust. More hostages just means more control." He traced a finger along the store schematic. "Ray, you take position here, watching the street and back entrance. Darius and I control the registers and safe. In and out in 3 minutes. Friday night deposit should be at least $5,000, maybe more." "Why not hit the bank directly?" Cole asked, not for the first time. Vince's patience visibly thinned. "Because banks have real security, genius. Hardware store has one old lady, no guard, and camera coverage I could hack with a Radio Shack kit." "What about the gun?" Darius asked. "Sheriff told me he took her piece 3 weeks ago, but she might have another." This information drew everyone's attention. "You sure about that?" Vince demanded. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Darius shrugged massive shoulders. "Just found out yesterday. My cousin works dispatch. Sheriff confiscated some revolver she kept under the counter. License problem." Vince considered this news, then smiled. "Even better. Place has been there forever without a robbery. Owner's comfortable, thinks nothing will happen. Now she's nervous but defenseless." He slapped the map for emphasis. "Perfect timing." Ray fidgeted with his pistol, a .22 that looked almost toy-like in his thin hands. "I don't like small towns. Everybody knows everybody. Somebody's gonna recognize us." "That's why we wear masks, Ray," Vince replied with exaggerated patience. "And that's why we're not from around here. By the time anyone figures anything out, we're 3 counties away." The planning session continued with Vince assigning positions and timing with military precision. The crude store map became increasingly annotated with notes, arrows, and timing markers. What none of them discussed openly was their desperation. Vince owed $16,000 to a loan shark in Baltimore who had already broken 2 of his fingers as a first notice. The twins needed cash to pay off a botched drug deal. Darius faced eviction, and Ray had a gambling debt that men in expensive suits had made clear would be collected in blood if necessary. Cedar Ridge Hardware represented salvation, a soft target in a quiet town with minimal police presence. The Friday night deposit was their ticket out of immediate danger. "Any questions?" Vince asked, folding the map. "What about the old lady?" Ray asked. "She's seen your face, right? From when you checked the place out." Vince's expression hardened. "No witnesses. That's the rule." The implication hung in the stale motel room air. No one challenged it. "Get some sleep," Vince ordered. "We meet back here at 6 tomorrow. Phones off, no drinking, no drugs." His gaze lingered on Ray, who had a known weakness for amphetamines. As the meeting broke up, Cole lingered behind. "This old lady, she doesn't seem like much of a threat." Vince snorted. "She's not. Probably never faced anything scarier than a price negotiation. Trust me, one look at Darius with a gun. She'll hand over everything and thank us for not hurting her." Outside in the parking lot, Ray glanced up at the fading light. "Small towns give me the creeps. Too quiet." "After tomorrow," Darius replied, "you can buy all the noise you want." None of them noticed the Cedar Ridge patrol car that cruised slowly past the motel entrance, the deputy inside making note of the out-of-state plates on their vehicles before continuing his route. Friday dawned with a gentle autumn drizzle that dissipated by mid-morning, leaving Cedar Ridge glistening under clear skies. Margaret arrived at the store earlier than usual, a sense of unease propelling her through her morning routine with heightened attention. "You're jumpy today," Fran observed as Margaret startled at the ringing phone. "Everything all right?" "Just didn't sleep well," Margaret replied, not mentioning her lingering dream or the suspicious customers from yesterday. No need to spread her anxiety to the staff. The morning rush exceeded even typical Friday levels. Thompson Construction had received approval for the elementary school renovation, and their entire crew descended on the hardware store for supplies. Rick Thompson, the burly foreman, handed Margaret a list that ran nearly 2 pages. "County finally approved the budget," he explained. "Need everything today so we can start Monday." The substantial order kept all hands busy. Jessie worked the register while Margaret, Fran, and Hank gathered items from throughout the store. By noon, the receipt total had set a new daily record, and it wasn't even half over. "Might need to make an extra bank run," Margaret mentioned to Jessie during a rare quiet moment. The cash drawer was already nearly full, unusual this early in the day. "I can go at 3 if you want," he offered. "My afternoon class was canceled." Margaret nodded, relieved. "Take half of what's in the safe. Leave enough for afternoon business." The afternoon brought a steady stream of weekend warriors preparing for household projects. Margaret found herself demonstrating proper drywall repair techniques to Mr. Abernathy, who had accidentally put his elbow through his bathroom wall. The older gentleman watched her hands with rapt attention as she explained the importance of proper taping. "You make it look so simple, Margaret," he said admiringly. "Don't know what this town would do without you." At 3:15, Jessie left with the bank deposit, considerably reducing Margaret's anxiety about keeping large amounts of cash on premises. He returned 30 minutes later, deposit slip safely filed. "All done, Ms. Wilson." Teller said to say hello. The late afternoon brought another unexpected surge as word spread about a coming storm system. Cedar Ridge residents, well-versed in occasional power outages, stocked up on flashlights, batteries, and emergency supplies. "Weather service says it'll hit tomorrow night." Carl from the gas station informed everyone within earshot as he purchased 3 flashlights. "Supposed to be a big one." Margaret added storm preparedness items to the display near the register, a practiced routine in small-town retail. The unexpected rush of weather-related purchases drove the day's revenue even higher. By 5:30, the register total showed the most profitable Friday in over 2 years. "Looks like we'll make rent this month," she remarked to Fran as they processed the contractor's credit card payment. "And then some," Fran agreed, tidying the counter paperwork. "Do you need me to stay late?" Margaret considered the question. Jessie was already scheduled until closing, and her unease about the suspicious customers remained. Having another person might be prudent. Then again, Fran had her grandson's birthday dinner tonight. "No, you go on," Margaret decided. "Jessie and I can handle closing." At 6:45, Fran departed after reconciling the day's receipts. The store had quieted, with only a few last-minute customers browsing the aisles. Hank had left at his usual 4 o'clock, his arthritis particularly bothersome after the busy day. "Quite a haul today," Jessie commented, eyeing the register tape, "even after the bank run." "Weather scares are good for business," Margaret replied. "Let's start closing procedures at 7:30 instead of waiting until 8. I doubt we'll get many more customers tonight." At 7:25, Bill Henderson, the high school shop teacher, became their final customer, purchasing specialized wood for his students' upcoming projects. The transaction was substantial, nearly $600 in cash. "Budget finally came through," he explained, counting out crisp $100 bills. "Been waiting 3 months to get these supplies." After he left, Jessie locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. "Early night," he commented. "Want me to start on the restocking while you close out the register?" "That would be great," Margaret agreed. "Focus on the storm supplies. We'll need those front and center tomorrow." As Jessie disappeared into the back aisles, Margaret began counting the day's receipts. Between the construction order, weather preparations, and the shop teacher's purchase, they'd had their best day in years. The final tally on the register tape showed $4,893.27 in cash sales, with credit card transactions pushing the daily total over $12,000. She recorded the amounts in the day's ledger, then prepared the bank deposit slip for the night drop. As she worked, the store settled into closing time quiet, punctuated only by Jessie's movements as he restocked shelves in the back. Margaret glanced at the clock, 7:52. In a few minutes they'd be finished and on their way home. Her earlier anxiety seemed overblown now. The suspicious men hadn't returned, and Dan had promised extra patrols. The night deposit would happen with Jessie accompanying her, another layer of security. She sealed the bank bag and locked it in the small safe under the counter until they were ready to leave. Standing, Margaret stretched her back after the long day, then reached for the intercom to call Jessie to the front. Before she could press the button, the front door exploded inward, with splintering around the lock as it was kicked open with tremendous force. The brass bell gave one violent ring as 5 masked figures burst into Cedar Ridge hardware. Time seemed to slow as the broken door frame splintered, wooden fragments spinning through the air like confetti in a grotesque celebration. Margaret's body froze while her mind accelerated, registering details with crystalline clarity. Black ski masks, dark clothing, gloved hands, and the unmistakable silhouettes of pistols. The lead figure, taller than the others and moving with calculated precision, pointed a gun directly at her chest. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt." His voice carried a practiced authority that suggested this wasn't his first robbery. 2 men flanked him, weapons raised, while a 4th positioned himself near the shattered doorway, watching the street. The 5th disappeared toward the back of the store. "On the floor. Now!" the leader barked, gesturing with his weapon. Margaret's legs felt leaden as she slowly lowered herself to her knees, then to a sitting position behind the counter. Her hand instinctively moved toward the panic button mounted underneath, but the leader vaulted over the counter with unexpected agility, grabbing her wrist before she could reach it. "I don't think so, Grandma." His grip tightened painfully as he yanked her away. From the counter. "Hands where I can see them." Always the panic button under the counter. So predictable. From the back of the store came a sudden crash followed by Jessie's startled voice. "What the—" His words cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of a scuffle. "Got the kid," called a thin, nervous voice. "He's secure." The leader, Vince, though Margaret couldn't know this, maintained his grip on her arm while scanning the store. "Anyone else here?" "No," Margaret managed, finding her voice. "We're closed. Just take what you want and go." The largest of the masked men, Darius, laughed, a rumbling sound devoid of humor. "Oh, we'll take what we want. Don't you worry about that." He moved behind the counter, immediately locating the register. "Open it," he commanded. The leader shoved Margaret toward the register, keeping his gun trained on her. With trembling fingers, she pressed the combination of keys that opened the cash drawer without a sale. The mechanism slid open with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely inappropriate for the moment. Darius began stuffing bills into a canvas bag, not bothering to count. "Where's the safe?" he demanded. "There isn't one," Margaret lied, thinking of the small lockbox beneath the counter containing the day's final deposit. The slap came without warning, snapping her head sideways with such force that she stumbled against the counter. Stars exploded in her vision as pain bloomed across her cheek. "Don't lie to me," Darius growled. "Every store has a safe. Where is it?" Before Margaret could respond, Jessie was dragged into view, the thin robber, Ray, holding him in a chokehold with a gun pressed to his temple. Blood trickled from Jessie's nose, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Found this one hiding by the loading dock," Ray announced, sounding pleased with himself. "Tried to use his phone." The leader stepped closer to Jessie, studying him through the eye holes of his mask. "Were you calling for help, kid? That's not very smart." He turned back to Margaret, his voice hardening. "The safe. Now, or your young friend gets a new breathing hole." "Under the counter," Margaret said immediately. "Left side. Combination is 26-14-32. The largest robber crouched down, located the small safe, and spun the dial according to her instructions. The lock clicked, and he extracted the bank bag with a triumphant grunt. "Jackpot," he announced, hefting the bag. "Must be 4 or 5 grand here." The leader nodded, seeming to relax slightly. "Good." Ray checked the back office. "Darius, finish with the registers. We're on the clock." Margaret's gaze darted around the store, assessing options that weren't really options at all. The shattered front door was 20 feet away, blocked by one gunman. Jessie was still held at gunpoint, The back exit would be watched. And somewhere in the store, the fifth robber lurked unseen. Her eyes fell on the power tool display along the right wall. The bright yellow of the nail guns stood out against the darker tools surrounding them. 10 feet away. Might as well have been a mile. The thin robber returned from the office. Nothing in the back. Some computer equipment, filing cabinets. No other cash. Time check, called the leader. 2 minutes in, responded one of the figures by the door. 2 minutes. Felt like 2 hours. Margaret's cheek throbbed where she'd been struck, and she could taste blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. Jesse caught her eye, giving a slight shake of his head as if warning her not to do anything rash. Smart boy. The largest robber finished emptying the register, then began searching the surrounding shelves and drawers. His massive hand closed around a stack of credit card receipts. These might be useful, he muttered, stuffing them into his pocket. Leave them, the leader commanded. Traceable. Cash only. As the robbers systematically dismantled her carefully organized workspace, Margaret noticed the lookout by the door growing increasingly agitated. Car just drove by, he reported. Slowed down. Might be coming back. The leader cursed. We're out in 30 seconds. Get the zip ties. The large robber produced a handful of plastic zip ties from his pocket. With practiced efficiency, he secured Jesse's hands behind his back, cinching the plastic painfully tight. Then he turned to Margaret. Your turn, Grandma. As he reached for her wrists, the leader raised a hand. Wait. He addressed Margaret directly. Where's your gun? The one you keep under the counter. The question startled her. How did they know about that? The sheriff confiscated it 3 weeks ago, she answered truthfully. License problem. The leader chuckled. That's right. He did. Didn't he? Something in his tone suggested prior knowledge, but Margaret had no time to process this as he continued. Zip her too. Then we're gone. As the large man grabbed her wrists, pulling them roughly behind her back, Margaret's attention was drawn to movement outside. Through the broken door, she glimpsed a patrol car rolling slowly past, its spotlight sweeping across the storefront. The lookout hissed a warning. Cops! Shit! The leader's composure cracked momentarily. Everyone down, lights off. Now! The store plunged into darkness as one of the robbers hit the main switches. Margaret felt herself shoved roughly to the floor, a heavy boot pressing between her shoulder blades. Not a sound, whispered a voice close to her ear. Or the kid dies first, then you. Through the broken door, the patrol car's headlights cast moving shadows across the ceiling. The pressure on Margaret's back increased as the boot owner tensed. For an eternal moment, the only sound was 5 sets of controlled breathing and Margaret's own thundering heartbeat. Then the patrol car continued on its way, headlights diminishing as it turned the corner. Clear, reported the lookout, relief evident in his voice. New plan, the leader announced as the largest robber hauled Margaret to her feet. No witnesses. A chill washed through her that had nothing to do with the autumn night. The clinical detachment in his voice made the meaning unmistakable. Please, she began. You have what you came for. Shut up. The leader turned to the others. Take them to the back. Make it look like they interrupted a burglary. Messy, but effective. Jesse made a strangled sound of protest as the thin robber dragged him toward the stockroom. Margaret felt her own arms gripped painfully as she was propelled in the same direction. In that moment, facing what she suddenly understood might be her last minutes alive, Margaret Wilson experienced a clarity she'd never known before. Time compressed, and her senses heightened. She noticed the tool display was now directly to her right. The pneumatic nail gun she'd handled yesterday sat at eye level, its safety disengaged for display purposes. The compressor hose was connected, pressurized for customer demonstrations. One chance. One desperate, impossible chance. As they passed the display, Margaret suddenly went limp, becoming deadweight in her captor's grasp. Unprepared for the shift, his grip loosened momentarily. She twisted violently, breaking free, and lunged for the nail gun. Her fingers closed around the yellow grip, the tool's weight familiar and solid. She swung around, finger finding the trigger as she brought the business end up toward her assailant. The pneumatic hiss and metallic thunk happened simultaneously. The 3-inch framing nail struck the robber's shoulder, penetrating his jacket and embedding itself deep into muscle and tissue beneath. His scream of pain and surprise shattered the controlled tension of the robbery. Margaret Wilson had just changed the rules of engagement. The nail protruded from Darius's shoulder like a grotesque metal thorn, its angled head gleaming dully in the dim store lighting. For one suspended moment, everyone froze, robbers and captives alike processing this sudden, violent shift in circumstances. Then Darius's bellow of pain shattered the tableau. He clutched at his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers as he staggered backward. She shot me. The bitch shot me. Margaret didn't waste the precious seconds of confusion. 25 years of organizing inventory had given her an intimate knowledge of the store's layout, knowledge that now might save her life. She ducked behind the nearest aisle display, the nail gun clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Get her!" the leader shouted, his controlled demeanor fracturing. "Ray, watch the kid." Margaret scrambled toward the lumber section, her mind racing through the store's floor plan. The shelving units created a labyrinth of narrow corridors, restrictive for pursuers, advantageous for someone who knew every shortcut and connection. Behind her, chaos erupted. The robbers shouted conflicting instructions while Darius continued his pain-filled cursing. Margaret heard the leader attempting to restore order. "Carson, front door." "Darius, shut up and pull that thing out." "Ray, if the kid moves, shoot him." A gunshot cracked through the store, the bullet splintering wood inches from Margaret's head. Instinctively, she dropped to her knees, using the lower shelves as cover. The lumber section lay 15 feet ahead, solid stacks of plywood and 2x4s that would provide better protection than the retail shelving. She half-crawled, half-ran, keeping low. The nail gun felt surprisingly natural in her grip, like an extension of her arm. Robert had taken her target shooting for years. The fundamentals weren't so different. Breath control, sight picture, trigger discipline. Except this was no paper target, and her weapon fired nails, not bullets. Reaching the lumber stacks, Margaret positioned herself at a corner where 2 aisles intersected. The location offered cover, visibility, and multiple escape routes, a defensive position Robert would have approved of. From here, she could see shadows moving near the front of the store but remained hidden herself. "Where'd she go?" one of the robbers called out. "Spread out," came the leader's response, his voice tight with controlled fury. "She's one old woman with a goddamn nail gun. Find her." Margaret measured her breathing, trying to quiet her thundering heart. The first nail had been fired in panic, a desperate act of self-preservation. Now she needed strategy. The nail gun held a strip of 20 framing nails, each capable of penetrating 2 inches of solid oak. Against flesh, they were lethal, a fact she found both horrifying and grimly reassuring. Footsteps approached her position. Margaret pressed herself against the plywood stacks, the rough edges digging into her back. A shadow stretched across the floor as one of the robbers moved cautiously down the adjacent aisle. come out, wherever you are," called a mocking voice. The large man, Darius, his tone slurred with pain and rage. "When I find you, I'm gonna make you eat this nail." The shadow grew larger. Margaret gripped the nail gun tighter, her index finger resting lightly on the trigger. She had one advantage the robbers didn't. She could recognize them by build and movement, while to them, she was just a target hiding in familiar territory. Darius's massive frame appeared at the aisle junction, his back to her as he peered down the row of shelving. The nail gun rose in Margaret's hands almost of its own accord. She aimed not for his body, but for the sleeve of his jacket, which extended from behind the shelving edge. The pneumatic hiss seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. The nail struck precisely where she'd aimed, driving through the fabric and into the wooden shelf beyond, effectively pinning Darius's arm in place. His surprised shout turned to pained fury as he realized what had happened. He yanked violently, trying to free himself, but the nail held fast, tethering him to the shelving unit. Margaret was already moving, circling away through her pre-planned route between lumber pallets. Behind her, Darius roared, "She's in the lumber section. I'm stuck. Someone get over here." Her path took her deeper into the store's rear areas. The stockroom offered potential sanctuary: concrete walls, heavy metal shelving, and a solid door that could be barricaded. If she could reach it, she might hold out until help arrived. Assuming help would arrive. Another gunshot rang out, wild and undisciplined. A jar of paint thinner exploded on a shelf near Margaret, the flammable liquid cascading over the floor. The acrid smell filled the air, adding a new danger to the already precarious situation. One spark could turn the hardware store into an inferno. "Stop shooting, you idiots!" the leader yelled. "You want to burn the place down? With us in it." Margaret used the distraction to advance closer to the stockroom. Just 20 feet now. 15. She could see the metal door, slightly ajar as Jesse had left it during restocking. A figure stepped out from behind a display of bathroom fixtures, blocking her path. The thin robber, Ray, his pistol wavering slightly in an unsteady grip. His mask couldn't hide the nervous swallow as he recognized her. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice cracking. "I found her. She's heading for the stockroom." Margaret froze, the nail gun half-raised. Ray's finger tightened on his trigger, and she braced herself for the impact. But the shot never came. Instead, a display of PVC pipes crashed down between them, the plastic tubes clattering across the floor. In the confusion, Margaret glimpsed Jesse at the end of the aisle, his bound hands having managed to topple the display. It was all the diversion she needed. The nail gun came up, and she fired twice in rapid succession. The first nail missed, embedding in the wall behind Ray. The second caught his sleeve, pinning it to the wooden door frame beside him. "Go, Ms. Wilson," Jesse shouted. "Run." Margaret didn't hesitate. She darted past the struggling Ray, grabbing Jesse's arm as she passed. Together they ducked into the stockroom, slamming the heavy door behind them. The stockroom provided only momentary sanctuary. Margaret knew its vulnerabilities. The metal door had no interior lock, and the loading dock exit would be watched. She quickly scanned the space, her mind overlaying the store's floor plan like a mental map. "Jesse, turn around," she whispered, setting down the nail gun to free his hands. She worked at the zip ties with trembling fingers. "Are you hurt?" "Just my pride," he replied, wincing as the plastic cut into his wrists. "And maybe my nose. That skinny guy hits harder than he looks." Outside, the robbers regrouped. Margaret heard the leader issuing commands, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Ray, stop whimpering and pull that nail out. Darius, cover the back exit. Carson, find the breaker box. I want control of the lights." The zip ties finally gave way. Jesse rubbed his wrists, angry red marks showing where the plastic had dug into his skin. "What's the plan, Ms. Wilson?" Margaret retrieved the nail gun, checking its remaining ammunition. "We need to separate them. Together, they're too dangerous. Divided, we might stand a chance." She pointed to the ceiling. "The ventilation crawlspace connects to the main store. You could use it to reach the office and call for help." Jesse's eyes widened. "What about you?" "I'll keep them busy. Buy you time." "That's crazy. They have guns. And I have home field advantage." Margaret indicated the shelves around them. "Plus, I've got a few tricks they won't expect." A bang against the stockroom door punctuated her words. "We know you're in there," called the leader. "Come out now and we'll make it quick. Make us come in after you and it gets messy." Margaret gave Jesse a boost toward the ceiling vent. "Use the phone in my office. If it's dead, try the old emergency radio in the bottom drawer. Go." As Jesse disappeared into the ventilation system, Margaret prepared her defense. The stockroom contained tools and materials organized by her own meticulous system, a system she now weaponized. She toppled a shelf of paint cans against the door, creating a barrier. Then she positioned herself behind a stack of lumber, nail gun ready. The metal door rattled violently as someone outside threw their weight against it. "Last chance," the leader called. Margaret remained silent, controlling her breathing as Robert had taught her at the firing range. The door burst open, the paint cans cascading across the floor. A figure rushed in, Darius, still favoring his injured shoulder but moving with surprising agility for his size. Margaret squeezed the trigger. The nail struck his thigh, eliciting a howl of pain. Before he could locate her position, she fired again, catching his other leg. Darius stumbled, crashing into a rack of piping. "She's turning me into a pincushion," he roared. "Someone get in here." Margaret was already moving, circling behind shelving units toward the secondary exit that connected to the garden section. Behind her, confusion reigned as more robbers poured into the stockroom only to find their quarry gone. The garden section lay in darkness, illuminated only by ambient light from the street lamps outside. Margaret navigated by memory, winding through displays of seasonal merchandise. From this position, she could monitor both the stockroom exit and the main store through the connecting doorway. The leader's voice carried clearly, "Carson, stay with Darius. Ray, circle around through the main floor. The rest of you with me." Margaret grimaced. They were adapting, coordinating their efforts to corner her. She needed to keep moving, keep them off balance. A shadow appeared in the doorway connecting to the main store. Margaret recognized the nervous posture of the thin robber, Ray. His pistol swept back and forth as he peered into the darkness. Nearby, a display of garden tools offered opportunity. Margaret slowly extended her arm, pushing a rack of metal rakes. The movement sent them clattering to the floor 20 feet from her position. Ray fired immediately, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding him. Margaret used the moment to slip through the doorway behind him, back into the main store. She found herself in the electrical section, surrounded by spools of wire and lighting fixtures. The robbers' frustrated voices echoed throughout the building. They'd lost track of her again, and tension was fraying their coordination. Margaret heard the leader berating his crew. "How hard is it to find one old woman? She's in her 50s. For Christ's sake." "She knows this place, Vince," came the reply, the first time Margaret had heard the leader's name. "It's like she's anticipating our moves." "Then we change the game," Vince snarled. "Carson, find the electrical panel. Cut all power to the building." Margaret's advantage was about to diminish considerably. She knew the store in darkness, but not as well as in light. The nail gun remained effective, but her ability to aim would be compromised. She needed a new strategy. The electrical panel was located near the break room, close to her current position. If she could reach it first, perhaps she could use the darkness to her advantage rather than theirs. Moving silently through the aisles, Margaret heard footsteps approaching. Careful, measured steps that suggested the searcher was trying to be stealthy. She crouched behind a display of circuit breakers, watching a silhouette move past the end of the aisle. Not Ray or Darius, this one moved differently. The lookout, perhaps, or the twin who had been watching the car. Less experienced in close combat, based on his hesitant movements. Margaret waited until he was directly opposite her position, then fired the nail gun at a metal shelving unit several aisles over. The distinctive sound drew the robber's attention away from her. As he turned, she emerged from cover and swung a heavy voltage tester like a club, catching him behind the knees. He went down with a surprised grunt, his weapon skittering across the floor. Before he could recover, Margaret had retrieved a roll of electrical tape from a nearby shelf and bound his hands with practiced efficiency. "Who's there?" he called, his voice higher-pitched with fear. "Vince? Ray?" Margaret didn't answer. She was already moving toward the electrical panel, the robber's gun now tucked into her waistband alongside the nail gun. From somewhere near the front of the store, she heard Vince shouting, "Carson? Carson! Report! Where are you?" Then the lights went out, plunging Cedar Ridge Hardware into total darkness. The darkness was absolute, a velvet blindfold wrapped around the store. For 3 heartbeats, silence reigned as everyone, hunters and hunted alike, adjusted to the sudden sensory deprivation. Then came the curses, the stumbling impacts of bodies against unseen obstacles, the clatter of merchandise falling from shelves. Margaret remained motionless, allowing her other senses to compensate for the loss of vision. The floor beneath her feet was tile, electrical department, third aisle. 5 steps forward would bring her to carpet samples. 8 steps left would reach plumbing fixtures. The store's layout existed in her mind with perfect clarity. A map built from decades of daily navigation. "Nobody move!" Vince's voice cut through the darkness. "Ray, where's that flashlight from your car?" "In my jacket. At the front counter." "Carson?" "Carson, answer me." Silence. "Darius? You still in the stockroom?" "Yeah," came the pained reply. "Can barely walk with these nails in my legs." Margaret used their voices to triangulate positions. Vince near housewares. Ray somewhere in central aisles. Darius immobilized in the stockroom. Carson, the one she'd disabled, silent in electrical. The 5th man unaccounted for, possibly still watching exits. She moved silently toward the emergency equipment display near the front register. 3rd shelf, right side, 2nd row. Her hands found the large maglite flashlight exactly where inventory dictated it should be. But she didn't switch it on. Light would make her an immediate target. Instead, she retrieved 2 more items. A contractor's headlamp and a package of glow sticks. The former she slipped into her pocket. The latter she unwrapped with deliberate care. "Spread out," Vince commanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "She can't have gone far. Use your phones for light." The pale blue illumination of cell phone screens created ghostly islands in the darkness. Margaret watched the lights moving through the store like fireflies, revealing positions while ensuring their owners remained night-blind to anything outside their small circles of illumination. Perfect. Margaret activated a single glow stick, its green chemical light casting an eerie glow. With practiced motion, she tossed it toward the garden section entrance, then quickly moved in the opposite direction. The diversion worked immediately. "There, by the garden doors." Ray's voice pitched higher with excitement. 2 phone lights converged on the glow stick while Margaret circled behind the central display islands. She needed to reach Jesse, ensure he'd made the call. The office lay 40 feet away, across open floor space now patrolled by armed men. A crash from the paint department suggested someone had collided with a display. "Damn it," Vince hissed. "Stop blundering around." Margaret activated the headlamp but kept it pointed downward, using just enough light to navigate while minimizing her visibility. She moved in a crouch, using the checkout counters as cover while advancing toward the office. Behind her, confusion mounted among the robbers. "This isn't a glow stick," Ray's disappointed voice carried. "It's just a glow stick." "She's playing with us?" Vince replied, dangerous tension in his voice. "Darius, can you move at all?" "Not unless you want me pulling these nails out." "Which I don't." Ray checked the office. Cole watched the front door. "I'm going to find Carson." Margaret froze. Ray was heading directly toward her destination, and possibly toward Jesse. She changed course, circling around the tool section to approach the office from the opposite direction. As she moved, her foot connected with something metallic that skittered across the floor. The sound might as well have been an explosion in the tense silence. "What was that?" Ray's voice, closer than expected. "Over by tools." His phone light swept in her direction. Margaret dropped flat behind a display of circular saw blades as the beam passed overhead. When darkness returned, she resumed her careful progress, this time lifting her feet with exaggerated care. A sudden crash from the housewares section, followed by Vince's startled curse, told her that the store's geography was extracting its toll from the invaders. The sound of breaking glass suggested someone had knocked over the dish display. Margaret reached the office door and eased it open, slipping inside before closing it behind her. The headlamp revealed an empty room. Jesse had either escaped through the ventilation system or found another route. The office phone lay on the desk, its cord cut. Margaret's heart sank until she spotted the lower drawer partially open. The emergency radio was gone. Jesse had remembered. She had no way of knowing if he'd successfully contacted help, but the missing radio offered hope. Now she needed to survive long enough for that help to arrive. The office provided temporary sanctuary, but remaining would eventually mean capture. Better to keep moving, keep them disoriented. Margaret gathered what she could use: a stapler, letter opener, duct tape, and a can of compressed air for cleaning computer keyboards. Outside, she heard Vince's voice grow closer. Found Carson. Someone taped him up. Ray, check the office. Time to move. Margaret switched off the headlamp and eased the door open a crack. Ray's phone light approached from the left, bobbing with his nervous gait. She waited until he was 5 feet from the door, then threw the can of compressed air toward the break room. The canister clattered loudly against the coffee maker. Ray's light jerked toward the sound. Someone's in the break room. As he rushed past the office door, Margaret slipped out behind him, moving silently in the opposite direction. She rounded the end cap display and collided directly with a solid form in the darkness. Strong hands gripped her shoulders. Got you. Vince's voice came, triumphant and low. Margaret brought the heavy mag light up in a practiced arc, connecting solidly with the side of his head. The impact sent a shock through her arm as Vince staggered sideways, his grip loosening. She twisted free and switched on the flashlight in the same motion, deliberately shining the powerful beam directly into his eyes. Temporarily blinded, Vince raised his arm to shield his face, his gun hand wavering. Margaret didn't hesitate. She drove forward, ramming the nail gun against his ribs and pulling the trigger. The pneumatic hiss was followed by Vince's choked cry as the nail penetrated his side. Not a lethal placement, but immediately debilitating. You, he gasped, dropping to one knee. Margaret was already moving away, the maglight illuminating her path as she fled toward the lumber section. Behind her, Vince's pained voice rose above the confusion. She's armed. She's got light. Ray, Cole, converge on lumber. The hunt continued, but the advantage had shifted. In the darkness of Cedar Ridge Hardware, Margaret Wilson was no longer merely prey. The lumber section provided both sanctuary and arsenal. Margaret moved between stacks of 2x4s and plywood sheets, creating a defensive position that limited approach angles. 25 years of inventory management had taught her the tensile strength of every material in the store. Now that knowledge became tactical. Voices converged on her position. Ray and Cole approached from opposite sides, attempting to flank her location. Their phone lights betrayed their positions while leaving Margaret in shadow. Careful, Ray warned. She nailed Vince good. He's down. Just an old lady, Cole replied, his voice betraying youth and inexperience. Probably got lucky. Margaret allowed herself a grim smile at the assessment. Luck had nothing to do with it. She had disabled 3 of the 5 robbers through knowledge and precision. The remaining 2 were separated, growing anxious, and in unfamiliar territory. She positioned herself at the junction of 2 aisles, the mag light switched off but ready. The nail gun held her last strip of framing nails, 6 remaining. She would make them count. Ray's light approached from the right, sweeping across lumber stacks. Come out, lady. It's over. We've called the others. Police scanner says they're occupied with an accident on the highway. No one's coming to help. The bluff was transparent. His nervous tone betrayed the lie. Margaret remained silent, waiting for him to commit to a position. When Ray reached the corner of the aisle, Margaret made her move. She drove the end of a 2x4 into his ankles, sweeping his legs from beneath him. Ray crashed to the floor, his phone skittering away, its light creating a disorienting strobe effect as it spun. Before he could recover, Margaret pounced, using her weight to pin his gun hand while pressing the nail gun against his shoulder. Don't, she warned quietly. Ray froze, recognition filtering through his fear. Please don't shoot me with that thing. Drop the gun. The weapon clattered to the floor. Margaret kicked it away, then fired a nail through Ray's jacket sleeve, pinning it to the wooden flooring beneath. A second nail secured his other sleeve, effectively immobilizing him without causing serious injury. Cole, Ray called out, panic edging his voice. She's got me. Help. Margaret retrieved Ray's phone, using its light to locate a rack of zip ties from the nearby organization section. With efficient movements, she secured Ray's ankles and wrists, reinforcing the nail restraints. "You didn't have to do this," she told him quietly. "You could have just taken the money and left." "It wasn't my idea," Ray replied, hysteria bubbling beneath his words. "Vince said no witnesses. I never wanted to hurt anybody." "Too late for that." Margaret gathered the fallen pistol and moved away from Ray's immobilized form, tracking Cole's position by sound. The third robber had gone silent, attempting stealth. Margaret switched off the phone light, relying on her mental map of the store's layout. The hardware section lay directly ahead, 20 feet of open floor space between display aisles. She heard Cole's careful footsteps approaching from her left. His phone light swept the area where Ray lay restrained, then jerked upward. "Ray, you okay?" "She's got a nail gun, man. Just get out of here." "Not without the others." Margaret circled behind a circular display of cabinet hardware, positioning herself near the flooring section where cushioning vinyl tiles would muffle her footsteps. As Cole advanced toward Ray's position, she paralleled his movement, maintaining distance while closing toward the electrical panel. Restoring light would eliminate her knowledge advantage, but the robbers' disorganization had reached critical mass. 3 disabled, 1 mobile but inexperienced, and the lookout likely still watching exits. The odds had shifted dramatically. Cole's light illuminated Ray's restrained form. "Jesus, what did she do to you? Just get these nails out, man. They hurt like hell." As Cole knelt beside his companion, Margaret reached the breaker box. With deliberate care, she restored power to selective sections, emergency lights only, creating pools of dim illumination while leaving most of the store in shadow. The sudden, partial return of light disoriented Cole. He squinted against the emergency bulbs, his adaptive night vision temporarily compromised. Margaret used his momentary blindness to approach from behind, the nail gun raised. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Cole froze, then slowly turned his head. The ski mask couldn't hide his youth, early 20s at most, with frightened eyes visible through the eye holes. "Gun on the floor." Slowly, he complied, carefully setting the weapon down. "We just wanted the money," he said, a tremor in his voice. "It wasn't supposed to go like this. It never is." Margaret gestured with the nail gun. "Face down, hands behind your back." As she secured Cole with zip ties, a voice called from the front of the store. "Cole? Ray? We've got company." Police car just pulled up across the street. The lookout, the 5th robber, had finally broken position. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Jessie had reached help. She checked her restraints on Cole, then collected both fallen pistols. 4 robbers neutralized. 1 remained mobile, but was now more concerned with escape than pursuit. Margaret moved toward the front of the store, navigating through familiar territory with renewed confidence. The tide had turned. What had begun as a desperate defense had become a methodical reclaiming of her territory. Near the shattered front door, she spotted movement. The final robber, peering anxiously through the broken frame at a patrol car parked across the street, its light bar dark but unmistakably official. Margaret raised the mag light, illuminating the robber from behind. "It's over," she said quietly. He spun, revealing a gun already drawn. "Stay back." Fear made his voice crack. "I'll shoot." Margaret didn't flinch. "No, you won't." She gestured with the nail gun. "Because unlike you, I don't miss." For 3 heartbeats, they faced each other in a standoff framed by emergency lights. Then sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The robber's resolve crumbled. He bolted through the broken door, fleeing into the night. Margaret moved to the front window, watching him disappear down the street. The approaching sirens promised resolution, but she kept the nail gun ready. Experience had taught her that desperate men often made desperate choices. As flashing lights appeared at the end of the street, she allowed herself to exhale slowly. The immediate danger had passed, but something in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A patrol car pulling around the side of the building rather than approaching the front entrance. Something about its movement seemed wrong, too cautious for an emergency response. Margaret narrowed her eyes, studying the vehicle's approach. The driver's silhouette was familiar, in a way that sent a chill through her spine. Sheriff Dan Holloway. Margaret's initial wave of relief at seeing Dan's patrol car faded as she observed his approach. No lights, no siren, despite the obvious emergency. He parked at the side entrance rather than the front, out of view from the main street. His movements as he exited the vehicle were furtive, cautious. A man trying to avoid attention rather than respond to a crisis. She retreated from the window, years of friendship with Dan battling against her rising suspicion. Something wasn't right. The approaching sirens from the main road grew louder, yet Dan made no move to coordinate with them or secure the scene as protocol would dictate. The side door opened, and Dan entered, his hand resting on his holstered service weapon. "Maggie?" he called out, voice pitched low. "You in here?" Margaret remained hidden behind the customer service counter, instinct keeping her silent. Dan moved further into the store, flashlight beams sweeping across the emergency-lit interior. "Hell of a mess," he muttered, surveying the scattered merchandise and broken displays. When his light found Ray pinned to the floor with nail-secured sleeves, Dan froze. Jesus Christ. His reaction seemed genuine, but something in his posture, the lack of surprise, the absence of immediate radio contact with dispatch, deepened Margaret's unease. "Vince," Dan called softly. "You still here?" Things got complicated. The name hit Margaret like physical blow. Dan knew the robber leader by name. The pieces aligned with sickening clarity. Dan's knowledge of her confiscated weapon, his convenient absence during the robbery, his arrival ahead of the official response. The sheriff's badge on his chest, once a symbol of protection, now reflected the emergency lights with a tainted gleam. Margaret weighed her options. The nail gun had 3 nails remaining, enough to keep Dan at bay, perhaps, but useless against his service weapon if he chose to use it. The pistols she'd taken from the robbers were unfamiliar, and she couldn't be certain they were loaded. Dan moved toward the rear of the store, calling out to Vince again. When he reached the lumber section and discovered Cole secured with zip ties, his posture changed, tension replacing caution. "Damn it, Vince, where are you?" Frustration edged his voice as he keyed his radio. "This is Holloway. False alarm at Cedar Ridge Hardware. Just some kids messing around. Stand down units." A crackling response came through. "Copy that, Sheriff. Units diverting to the highway accident." The approaching sirens faded, redirected away from the store. Dan holstered his radio and drew his service weapon, dropping all pretense of a legitimate response. "Margaret," he called, voice hardening. "I know you're in here. Come out now, and we can talk this through." Margaret remained motionless, processing the betrayal. Dan, who had dated her daughter in high school, who had been a pallbearer at Robert's funeral, who had shared countless morning coffees at her counter, was involved with the men who had just tried to kill her. "I can explain," Dan continued, moving methodically through the store. "It's not what you think." From the rear of the store came a pained voice. "Dan? That you? I'm back here. The old lady shot me with a nail gun. Hang on, Vince." Dan changed direction, heading toward the voice. Margaret used the distraction to slip from behind the counter, moving silently toward the office. She needed distance, time to think. The office had a sturdy door, a landline if the robbers hadn't cut it, and potential weapons in the supply cabinet. She reached the office door as Dan discovered Vince in the power tool section, a nail protruding from his side, blood staining his shirt. "What the hell happened?" Dan demanded, helping Vince to a sitting position. "She went crazy with a nail gun," Vince gasped. "Got Darius in the shoulder and legs. Got me in the ribs. She's like a ghost in here, Dan. Knows every corner." "Of course she does. She's worked here 25 years. Dan examined the nail wound with a grimace. "You'll live. Where are the others?" "Ray and Carson are pinned down somewhere. Cole was looking for them. 5th guy probably ran. Keeping your crew under control isn't your strong suit, is it?" Dan's tone held more irritation than concern. This was supposed to be simple. Get in, get the cash, eliminate the witnesses, make it look like a robbery gone bad. "It was the nail gun," Vince protested. Who expects a grandma to start shooting nails? You said she'd be defenseless without her revolver. Apparently, I underestimated her. Dan helped Vince to his feet. Let's get the others and clear out. This is already too messy. Margaret eased the office door closed, processing the implications of what she'd heard. This wasn't a random robbery, it was targeted, premeditated, with Dan's direct involvement. The gun license mix-up had been deliberate, ensuring she'd be vulnerable when the crew arrived. The betrayal burned like acid. She'd trusted Dan, confided in him, relied on his protection. And all along, he'd been setting her up. The question was why? Cedar Ridge Hardware barely made enough to cover expenses most months. The day's take was unusually large, but hardly worth the risk for a sheriff with 20 years on the force. Unless there was something more. Margaret moved to her desk, searching for the landline phone. The cord had been cut, just as she'd feared. The computer was useless without internet, which ran through the same severed line. She was trapped in the office with Dan and an unknown number of robbers outside, all now aware that she was still alive and fighting back. Footsteps approached the office door. Margaret? I know you're in there. Dan's voice, calm and reasonable, as if they were discussing a parking ticket rather than attempted murder. We need to talk. She remained silent, searching the office for anything useful. The supply cabinet yielded a box cutter and scissors, better than nothing, but poor substitutes for the nail gun she still clutched. Look, this got out of hand, Dan continued. It wasn't supposed to go this way. Just open the door, and we'll sort this out. Like you sorted out my gun license? Margaret finally replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. A pause. So you figured that out. You always were sharp. Dan sighed audibly. It was a necessary precaution. We knew you kept that revolver under the counter. We? Who's we, Dan? Since when do sheriffs partner with armed robbers? It's complicated, Maggie. Money problems. Gambling debts. Then some people from the city made an offer I couldn't refuse. Just occasional information at first. Which houses would be empty during vacation season. When certain businesses made their deposits. And tonight? Was killing me and Jesse part of your information sharing? Another pause, longer this time. That wasn't the original plan. But Vince doesn't like loose ends. Margaret processed this, her mind racing. The license suspension. That was you. Had to make sure you couldn't defend yourself. Figured you'd be angry but ultimately compliant when faced with armed men. Should have known you'd find another way. A note of reluctant admiration colored his voice. A nail gun, Maggie? Really? Robert always said use what you have. Her eyes fell on the emergency exit plan mounted on the wall. A detailed map of the building including a feature few people remembered. The old coal chute that had been converted to a storage access in the basement. Robert would be proud, Dan said, his tone softening. But it's over now. I've got your boy Jesse in custody. Caught him trying to reach the parking lot. He's fine, but his continued health depends on you opening this door. Margaret's blood ran cold. If you hurt him, that's entirely up to you. Open the door, we talk terms. Keep it closed. He let the threat hang unfinished. The door handle turned locked, but the flimsy interior mechanism wouldn't withstand much force. Margaret made her decision, positioning herself behind the door. I'm opening it, she called. Don't hurt Jesse. Smart choice. She turned the lock, then quickly moved aside as the door swung open. Dan entered cautiously, service weapon raised, scanning the room before his gaze settled on her. Where's Jesse? Margaret demanded. Safe. For now. Dan gestured with his gun. The nail gun. Put it down. Margaret complied, setting it on the desk. I want to see him. All in good time. Dan kept his distance, respecting the threat she still represented even unarmed. Here's the situation. This robbery went wrong, obviously, but it can still work out. The story will be that armed robbers hit the store, you and Jesse were held hostage. I responded to the silent alarm. Unfortunately, in the confusion, you were both killed. Tragic. But it happens. And the robbers? Escaped. Maybe we catch them later, maybe we don't. Either way, the case eventually goes cold. Margaret studied the man she'd considered a friend for decades. Why, Dan? What could possibly be worth all this? $200,000. My cut for setting up a string of robberies along the interstate. Small towns, minimal police, maximum profit. He shrugged. Started small, just information. But once you're in, there's no getting out. And my gun license? That was just coincidence. No, we'd already selected the hardware store as a target. When I realized it was your place, something like regret flickered across his features. I tried to suggest another location, but Vince had already cased it. So I made sure you couldn't defend yourself. Figured it would be quick, clean. Nothing about this is clean. Margaret's gaze drifted to the emergency exit plan on the wall, measuring distances in her mind. What happens now? Now we find Jesse, and this ends. Dan gestured toward the door. After you. Margaret moved toward the doorway, mentally rehearsing her next actions. As she passed Dan, she stumbled slightly, brushing against him. Careful, he warned, maintaining his aim. Sorry. Tired. It's been a long night. They emerged into the main store area where Vince waited, holding his wounded side. Behind him, Cole and Ray had been freed from their restraints, both looking worse for wear but mobile. Where's the kid? Dan asked. Darius has him in the stockroom, Vince replied. Found him trying to use the loading dock phone. Let's finish this, Dan said, gesturing for Margaret to walk ahead. As they approached the stockroom, Margaret's hand slipped into her pocket, fingers closing around the sheriff's badge she'd lifted when she brushed against him. The heavy metal weight felt solid, its edges sharp. The stockroom door stood open. Inside, Darius held Jesse in a painful arm lock, the young man's face pale with fear. Ms. Wilson, Jesse's voice cracked. I'm sorry, I couldn't get through on the radio. It's okay, Jesse. Margaret kept her voice steady, her eyes conveying what her words couldn't. Be ready. Enough reunion, Vince snapped. Let's get this over with. Dan nodded, raising his weapon. Turn around, Maggie. I don't want you to see this. After 30 years of friendship, I think I deserve to look you in the eye, Dan. He hesitated, an unreadable emotion crossing his face. Have it your way. In that moment of hesitation, Margaret made her move. She flung the sheriff's badge with all her strength, its metal edge striking Dan's gun hand with surprising force. The service weapon discharged, the bullet going wide as Dan reflexively grabbed his injured hand. Run! Margaret shouted to Jesse, lunging toward the stockroom's rear exit. Jesse drove his elbow into Darius's solar plexus, breaking free as the larger man doubled over. Together, they raced toward the basement access door, Margaret yanking it open as bullets splintered the wall beside them. After them! Vince shouted, his voice fading as Margaret and Jesse descended the stairs into the basement darkness, slamming and locking the heavy door behind them. The basement of Cedar Ridge Hardware had served as overflow storage since Margaret's first year as manager. The narrow concrete room stretched the length of the building, its ceiling crossed by exposed pipes and electrical conduits. Emergency lights cast weak illumination over densely packed shelves and forgotten seasonal displays. We need to barricade the door, Margaret whispered, already dragging a metal shelving unit across the floor. Jesse joined her, pushing from the other side. They're coming, he warned, as angry voices and heavy footsteps sounded above them. They positioned the shelf against the door, then reinforced it with bags of concrete mix and boxes of ceramic tile. The makeshift barricade wouldn't stop determined attackers forever, but would buy precious minutes. Are you hurt? Margaret asked, finally taking stock of Jesse's condition in the dim light. Just bruised. He touched his swollen nose gingerly. Ms. Wilson, the sheriff. I know. The betrayal still burned, but there was no time to process it. Did you reach anyone on the radio? Jesse shook his head. I tried, but it was dead. Battery, maybe? Or they jammed it somehow. Margaret nodded grimly, surveying their underground sanctuary. We need to find another way out. There's an old coal chute that was converted to a delivery access point years ago. She moved toward a stack of filing cabinets against the far wall. Should be behind here somewhere. The sheriff said something about meeting someone at midnight, Jessie offered, helping her push aside the cabinets. Someone coming to collect the money and clean up the mess. His words. How long do we have? Jessie checked his watch. About 40 minutes. The cabinets revealed a section of wall that looked subtly different from its surroundings, newer concrete surrounding an older metal hatch. Margaret ran her fingers along the seam. This is it. Used to connect to the alley before the renovation in '98. A thunderous crash from above made them both flinch. They're searching room by room, Margaret whispered. They'll be here soon. The door at the top of the stairs rattled violently as someone tested their barricade. They're down here, Dan's voice called. Basement's barricaded. Margaret examined the hatch more closely, dismay growing as she discovered its condition. The mechanism's rusted solid. We can't open it from this side. She stepped back, mind racing through alternatives. We need to think differently. Her eyes settled on a forgotten corner of the basement where old building plans were stored in metal tubes. Wait, I have an idea. She hurried to the tubes, quickly locating one labeled, Original Structure, 1952. The yellowed blueprint inside unfolded to reveal the building's original layout, including something critical, a detailed diagram of the basement's structural supports and access points. There, Margaret pointed to a small notation near the south wall. Emergency access point added during the Cold War. The original owner was paranoid about nuclear attacks. It's a small tunnel that connects to the storm drainage system. Jessie's eyes widened. An actual escape tunnel? That's straight out of a movie. Harold Jenkins wasn't one for half measures. Margaret traced the route with her finger. Should come out 2 blocks away, behind the library. Above them, the barricaded door shuddered under impact. Someone was trying to force it open. We don't have much time, Margaret warned, moving toward the south wall. Help me find it. Should be behind these paint supplies. They worked quickly, shifting boxes of old inventory to reveal a small metal door set flush with the concrete, its outline nearly invisible beneath years of dust and cobwebs. A simple lever served as its handle, the mechanism mercifully free of the rust that plagued the coal chute. It's here, Jessie whispered excitedly. Margaret pulled the lever, and the door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a narrow tunnel barely large enough for an adult to crawl through. The musty smell of undisturbed decades wafted out. You first, she urged Jessie. I'll be right behind you. Jessie hesitated, glancing at her bloodied face and the growing bruise on her cheek. Are you sure you can make it? That's a tight fit. I'll manage. Margaret's tone brooked no argument. Go. Now. As Jessie disappeared into the tunnel, Margaret turned back to survey the basement. They needed time. Time for Jessie to navigate the tunnel. Time to reach help. The barricade was already shifting as their pursuers applied greater force to the door. With grim determination, she gathered supplies. Cans of paint thinner, bottles of acetone, rags, and a box of emergency flares. Working quickly, she created a defensive perimeter around the escape tunnel, saturating rags with flammable liquids and positioning them strategically. The basement door finally gave way, the barricade toppling as Dan and Vince forced their way through. Margaret ducked behind a stack of lumber, watching as flashlight beams swept the basement. Maggie, Dan called, false concern in his voice. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Margaret remained silent, easing toward the tunnel entrance. She needed just a few more seconds to ensure Jessie had cleared the first section. Check behind those shelves, Vince ordered Ray, who had followed them down. They've got to be hiding somewhere. Margaret struck a flare, its harsh crimson light suddenly illuminating the basement. She touched it to the nearest soaked rag, which ignited instantly, flames racing along her prepared path. Fire! Ray shouted, stumbling backward. Margaret used the distraction to slip into the tunnel, pulling the metal door closed behind her. The narrow passage felt suffocating, but she forced herself forward, crawling on elbows and knees toward the distant exit. Behind her, muffled shouts and the crackling of flames suggested her diversion was working. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and concrete, decades of dust coating every surface. Her injured cheek throbbed with each movement, but she pressed on, following the faint sounds of Jesse's progress ahead. The blueprints had indicated a journey of approximately 40 yards, a short distance on foot, but an eternity when crawling through a confined space barely large enough to accommodate her shoulders. "Ms. Wilson," Jesse's voice echoed softly from ahead. "I think I see the exit. Keep going," she encouraged, fighting against growing claustrophobia. "Don't wait for me." The tunnel took a sharp turn, then began to slope upward. Margaret's muscles burned with the effort, but the thought of Dan's betrayal and what awaited if she stopped pushed her forward. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, she saw a circle of night sky ahead. The exit. Jesse had already emerged and reached back to help her through the opening. Together, they collapsed on damp grass, gulping fresh air after the tunnel's stale confines. They had emerged behind the library as the blueprint promised, hidden from the street by a stand of ornamental shrubs. In the distance, they could see emergency vehicles' lights reflecting off downtown buildings, the highway accident that had diverted the initial police response. "We need to find help," Jessie panted, helping Margaret to her feet. "Real help." Margaret nodded, wiping dust from her face as she stared back toward the hardware store. No visible flames yet, which meant her diversion fire was still contained to the basement. The fire suppression system should activate soon, preventing a full-scale blaze. "State police," she decided. "Dan controls the local deputies. We need someone outside his influence." Jessie nodded, supporting her as they moved away from the tunnel exit. "The gas station on the highway has a landline, 2 blocks that way." Margaret took one last look at Cedar Ridge Hardware, her life's work, now a crime scene. Then she turned away, leaning on Jessie as they disappeared into the darkness. Behind them, the first police siren wailed in the distance. The 24-hour gas station at the edge of Cedar Ridge stood as an island of fluorescent light in the darkness. Its aging payphone, preserved despite the digital age, represented their best hope for outside help. Margaret leaned against the building's wall while Jessie made the call, her body finally registering the toll of the night's events. "State police," Jessie spoke urgently into the receiver. "This is an emergency." Margaret surveyed their surroundings, vigilant for any sign of Dan's patrol car. The highway stretched empty in both directions, occasional headlights appearing and disappearing in the distance. The children toward the narrow escape route. "You and I go to Harrison," he told Margaret. "One warrior with us. If your plan fails, we still fight." She clutched Gregory's cross tightly. "It won't fail. Harrison is a man of honor. I believe that. Crawford is not," Nakohi reminded her grimly. "And he has many guns." As they prepared to implement their desperate plan, Margaret secured Gregory's cross inside her tunic, feeling its weight against her heart. In choosing this path, she was following in the former priest's footsteps, seeking reconciliation rather than division, understanding rather than conflict. Whether it would lead to salvation or destruction remained to be seen. The scout who had remained with them led them through a side passage that circled back toward where Harrison's group had been spotted. They moved silently, communicating only with hand signals as the sounds of the searching party grew louder. Margaret touched Nakohi's arm before they made the final turn that would reveal their presence. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I don't regret choosing this path." His hand briefly covered hers. "Apaches say true warrior, not one who never falls, but one who always rises. You rise many times, Margaret of Boston." Then, holding Gregory's transformed cross before her like a talisman, she stepped into the passageway to confront whatever fate awaited. Margaret stepped into the torchlit passageway, Gregory's cross held visibly before her. Behind her, Nakohi and the warrior remained partially concealed, ready to act if her gamble failed. "Lieutenant Harrison," she called, her voice echoing through the stone corridors. The sounds of movement ceased, replaced by the metallic click of weapons being readied. A moment later, Harrison's voice responded cautiously. Who's there? Identify yourself. My name is Margaret Whalen. You knew me as Sister Margaret. Silence, then. Step forward slowly. Hands visible. She advanced, cross still extended, until she stood in a wider section of the passage. Lieutenant Harrison appeared with 4 soldiers, all with rifles trained on her. His eyes widened at her appearance. Dressed in Apache clothing, hair loose around her shoulders, bearing no resemblance to the nun he had met at the mission. Sister Margaret? Disbelief colored his voice. What in God's name? Just Margaret now, she corrected. And I've come to show you something you need to see. Harrison signaled his men to maintain their aim. You're wanted for aiding hostiles, possibly for treason. I'm under orders to bring you in. Under Crawford's orders, you mean? She took a careful step closer. The man who's been manipulating you, the army, everyone in the territory for his own profit. That's a serious accusation, with serious evidence to support it. She held his gaze. Lieutenant, you're an honorable man following what you believe are legitimate orders. But you've been deceived. There have been no Apache raids. Crawford fabricated those reports to push the army into removing the Apache from land that contains valuable mineral deposits. Harrison's expression remained skeptical, but he hadn't given the order to arrest her yet. You expect me to take the word of a woman who abandoned her vows to live with hostiles? Not my word alone. She gestured toward the passage behind her. I have someone who can corroborate everything. Harrison tensed. More Apache? Someone you'll want to hear. She turned slightly. Sheriff? It's safe to come forward. From the shadows emerged not Nakohe but Sheriff Walton. His appearance as surprising to Margaret as to Harrison. The sheriff approached cautiously, hands visible. She's telling the truth, Lieutenant, he said. I've been tracking Crawford's operation for months. Harrison lowered his weapon slightly. Sheriff? What are you doing here? Same as you. Following tracks. Walton moved to stand beside Margaret. Difference is, I know what we're really tracking. Margaret controlled her shock at the sheriff's unexpected appearance, understanding that fate, or providence, had intervened in their desperate plan. Show him, she urged. Walton produced a leather portfolio from inside his coat. Crawford's been working with Western Mining Consortium. These are copies of land claims he's filed, all in Apache territory, all dated before the relocation order was issued. He knew the Apache would be removed because he arranged it. Harrison took the documents, scanning them with growing concern. This doesn't prove the raids were fabricated. This might. Walton withdrew another paper. Affidavit from a trader who sold Crawford rifles, the same type later used in what he claimed were Apache attacks on settlers. And this, Margaret added, producing the military order she had taken from Nakohe. Notice the date, Lieutenant. The relocation order was signed 2 weeks before the raids, Crawford reported. The decision to remove the Apache was made before any alleged hostilities. Harrison studied the documents, his military discipline visibly warring with his sense of justice. Even if this is true, I have orders. Orders based on lies, Margaret pressed. Is that the honor you pledged to uphold when you became an officer? The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Where is Nakohe now? And the other Apache? Margaret hesitated, unwilling to reveal their location. Before she could formulate a response, a new voice joined the conversation. I am here. Nakohe stepped into view, unarmed, his bearing proud despite the rifles that immediately swung in his direction. Harrison's men awaited the order to fire. Hold your fire, Harrison commanded. Then to Nakohe. You're a wanted man, Bear Spirit. Wanted for what? Nakohe asked calmly. Protecting my people? Living on land that was Apache when your grandfather's grandfather was not yet born. There are legal channels. Legal? Sheriff Walton interrupted. Like Crawford bribing territorial officials? Like falsifying reports to the army? Harrison's expression hardened. I need more than papers and accusations. Then I'll give you proof you can't ignore, came another voice. Crawford himself. emerging from a connecting passageway with 6 rough-looking men, none in uniform. Proof that this woman and this lawman are Apache sympathizers who've turned against their own kind. Margaret felt the situation deteriorating rapidly. Crawford's appearance changed everything. Wherever Sheriff Walton had come from, whatever evidence he carried, Crawford clearly had his own plans. Crawford, Harrison acknowledged coldly. This is a military operation. Your civilian trackers should be following, not leading. Just offering assistance, Lieutenant. Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. And bringing news. Your commanding officer has authorized immediate action against hostiles. No more delays. Colonel Bridger authorized this? Harrison looked skeptical. Orders arrived by courier this morning. The Apache are to be removed or eliminated. All of them. Crawford's gaze fixed on Margaret. Including white collaborators. Before Harrison could respond, they were interrupted by an unexpected sound. Children's voices echoing from a side passage. To Margaret's horror, Najoni appeared with the orphan children, escorted by Crawford's men. Found these ones trying to escape through the back ways, one man reported. The old woman put up a fight. Najoni's face was bloodied, but her expression remained defiant as she protectively gathered the frightened children around her. Lieutenant, Margaret pleaded. These are orphan children and a medicine woman. They've committed no crime. Apache brats grow into Apache warriors, Crawford countered. Better solve the problem at the root. The naked brutality of his statement shocked even Harrison. That's not how the United States Army conducts itself, Crawford. Isn't it? What do you think reservations are, Lieutenant? Slow death instead of quick. Crawford moved closer to Harrison, lowering his voice. We both know how this ends. Either the Apache disappear or progress stops. You can be on the right side of history or buried by it. The standoff intensified, with Harrison caught between duty and conscience. Crawford's men and Army soldiers facing each other as much as they faced the Apache. Margaret tried to edge closer to Najoni and the children, but Crawford noticed. Stay where you are, apostate, he warned. You chose your side. Yes, I did, she acknowledged. The side of truth. Crawford laughed. Truth? Out here, truth is whatever the last man standing says it is. He turned to Harrison. Lieutenant, I recommend we conclude this operation. Take Nakohi into custody, along with the former sister. The others can be dealt with according to your orders. My orders were to relocate, not massacre, Harrison replied stiffly. Circumstances have changed. Hostiles resisting relocation are to be treated as combatants. Crawford produced an official-looking document. Colonel Bridger's latest directive. Read it yourself. As Harrison reluctantly took the paper, Margaret felt movement behind her. Nakohi's warrior, still hidden, preparing to act. She subtly motioned for him to wait, sensing that violence would only confirm Crawford's narrative. Instead, she took a different approach. Lieutenant Harrison, before you make your decision, there's something else you should see. She pointed to an opening leading deeper into the cavern. In that chamber is evidence even Crawford can't dispute. More papers, Crawford scoffed. We're done with delays. Not papers, Margaret said. Something carved in stone thousands of years ago. Something that changes everything about this land and who belongs here. Harrison studied her face, then Crawford's. Something in the contrast between her calm certainty and Crawford's growing agitation seemed to influence him. 5 minutes, he decided. Show me. Lieutenant, this is a transparent attempt to... Crawford began. 5 minutes, Harrison repeated firmly. Sheriff, you and 2 of my men accompany us. The rest stay here maintaining positions. Crawford's expression darkened, but he acquiesced with poor grace. Fine. A wild goose chase before we finish this. Their small group, Harrison, Margaret, Nakohi, Sheriff Walton, 2 soldiers, and Crawford, moved deeper into the cave system. Margaret led them with certainty born of her time with Najoni, who had shown her maps of the sacred caves drawn from generations of Apache knowledge. The passage widened suddenly into an enormous cavern whose ceiling soared beyond the reach of their torchlight. Along one vast wall, illuminated by a shaft of daylight from a natural chimney in the rock, spread a panel of ancient petroglyphs, hundreds of figures carved into the stone surface, preserved in the dry cave air for millennia. "What is this place?" Harrison asked, voice hushed by the natural grandeur. "The Apache call it the Hall of Ancestors," Margaret explained. "It's one of their most sacred sites." Nakohi approached the wall reverently. "Many generations come here. Many hands make these marks." The petroglyphs depicted human figures, animals, celestial objects, and symbolic designs, some overlapping others in layers of history. But Margaret directed their attention to one specific section. "Look here," she said, pointing to a series of figures that clearly showed two distinct groups of people, one with European-style clothing and cross symbols, the other with traditional indigenous attributes, engaged not in conflict but in cooperation. Between them were symbols for water, crops, and what appeared to be shared dwellings. "This panel dates from the earliest Spanish contact," she explained. "It shows that peaceful coexistence was once reality, not fantasy. The Apache weren't always enemies of Europeans. They became adversaries only after generations of broken promises and stolen land." Harrison studied the ancient art with evident fascination. "How old is this?" 300 summers, Nakohi answered. "My grandfather's grandfather knew the white priests who came before soldiers. They trade, learn from each other." "Touching history lesson," Crawford interrupted. "Irrelevant to our current situation." "Is it?" Sheriff Walton challenged. "Seems to me it's exactly our situation. Choice between cooperation or bloodshed." Harrison turned from the petroglyphs to Crawford. "You said the Apache attacked 3 ranches last month. Killed settlers. That's why we're here." "They did," Crawford insisted. "I saw the bodies myself." "No," Sheriff Walton contradicted. "You reported finding bodies. No one else verified your claims. And by the time Army investigators arrived, you had already buried the supposed victims." "Are you calling me a liar, Sheriff?" "I'm calling you a murderer." Walton's voice hardened. "Those weren't Apache attacks. You killed those settlers yourself, the Johnston family who refused to sell their land claim that bordered Apache territory. Land you needed for your mining operation." The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Crawford's hand moved toward his holstered pistol. "Careful, Crawford," Harrison warned, his own hand resting on his sidearm. "The sheriff's making a serious allegation." "Based on evidence," Walton continued. "I found this in Crawford's office while he was out with you." He produced a surveyor's map with the Johnston property prominently marked. Scrawled across it in Crawford's handwriting, "Problem solved by July 1st. The Johnstons were killed on June 28th, Walton noted. 3 days before your deadline." Crawford's facade cracked. "You broke into my office? That's illegal search." "That proves nothing." "Maybe not alone," the sheriff agreed. "But combined with the weapons receipts, the mining claims filed before the attacks, the witnesses." Ends. Dan's expression flickered. A moment of genuine regret that confirmed Jesse remained alive for now. "Where is he, Maggie?" "Safe. Beyond your reach." She kept the nail gun trained on Hargrove while addressing Dan. 28 years of friendship, Dan. You stood at Robert's funeral. You taught Sarah to drive. Was it all a lie?" "Not all." Something in Dan's voice suggested sincerity. "But gambling debts don't pay themselves. Hargrove offered a way out. By sacrificing me. It was supposed to be a simple robbery gone wrong. Quick and clean." "Nothing about this is clean." Margaret shifted slightly, keeping both men in view. "How many others, Dan? How many accidents and robberies have you arranged?" Before he could answer, Hargrove interjected. "Enough talking. Finish this, Sheriff." Dan hesitated, his weapon unwavering but his resolve visibly conflicted. "He won't do it," Margaret said quietly. "Not face to face. Not someone he's known his whole life. That's why you hired outside help, isn't it, Dan? Easier to live with yourself when someone else pulls the trigger." "She's manipulating you," Hargrove snapped. Do your job. The standoff stretched, tension building with each passing second. Outside, distant sirens wailed. Approaching, not receding. State police, Margaret explained, noting the recognition in both men's eyes. Jesse made the call. It's finished. Hargrove's calculated demeanor cracked. Shoot her, you fool. We can still contain this. Dan's expression hardened, but not in the way Hargrove expected. Put the gun down, Walter. What? I said put it down. Dan shifted his aim, covering both Hargrove and Margaret. This has gone too far. You're making a mistake, Hargrove warned. I own half the county officials. Cross me and you'll never work again. Assuming you avoid prison. Maybe. Dan's jaw tightened. But I draw the line at killing kids. And Maggie deserves better. The developer's face contorted with rage. You pathetic. He lunged suddenly, not toward Dan but at Margaret, pulling a concealed blade from his sleeve. The attack came with surprising speed for a man his age. 3 shots fired simultaneously. Dan's service weapon, Margaret's nail gun, and a third from the direction of the front door. Hargrove stumbled, blood blooming across his chest from Dan's bullet. The nail from Margaret's gun protruded from his shoulder. But most surprising was the third wound. A clean shot to his leg from a state police-issue sidearm. Police! Weapons down. Now! Commanded a voice from the entrance. 3 uniformed state troopers moved in with tactical precision, weapons trained on all parties. Behind them came Jesse and a middle-aged trooper who bore a striking resemblance to Miguel from the gas station. Margaret Wilson? Called the lead officer. Here, she replied, carefully setting down both weapons. Sheriff Holloway just saved my life. Dan lowered his gun, placing it on the floor before raising his hands. His expression mixed resignation with something like relief. About time you got here, he said to the troopers. I've got a lot to tell you. As the officers secured the scene and radioed for medical assistance, Margaret sat heavily on a nearby display chair, the adrenaline finally ebbing from her system. Jesse rushed to her side, his face awash with concern and triumph. It worked, he said. Your plan actually worked. Not exactly as intended, she admitted, watching as troopers handcuffed both Dan and the wounded Hargrove. But close enough. Through the broken front door, more emergency vehicles arrived. Ambulances, additional police units, even a fire truck responding to lingering smoke from the basement. Cedar Ridge was waking up to the night's events, lights appearing in windows along Main Street as curious residents investigated the commotion. As a paramedic approached to examine her injuries, Margaret's gaze fell on Sheriff Dan Holloway being led to a police vehicle. Their eyes met briefly across the debris-strewn store. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. 3 decades of friendship ended in betrayal, yet somehow concluding with a final act of redemption. The paramedic gently turned her face to examine the bruising. These are going to need attention, ma'am. I've had worse, Margaret replied, her eyes traveling to the sheriff's radio that now sat on the counter. The instrument that would ultimately connect her to legitimate authorities and help bring the truth to light. The store can be rebuilt. Truth is harder to repair once broken. Outside, the night sky had begun yielding to the first hints of dawn. A fitting symmetry for the night's darkness giving way to clarity and justice. Dawn broke over Cedar Ridge with unusual activity for the small town. State police cruisers, crime scene vehicles, and news vans transformed the normally quiet Main Street into an impromptu command center. Yellow tape cordoned off Cedar Ridge hardware, now a complex crime scene being documented by forensic technicians in white coveralls. Margaret sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over her shoulders despite the mild morning. A paramedic finished cleaning the cut on her cheek and applied butterfly bandages. You should really go to the hospital for observation, he advised. Possible concussion. Multiple contusions. I'm staying, Margaret replied firmly. This is my store. Nearby, Jesse spoke with a state police detective, gesturing animatedly as he recounted the night's events. His parents hovered close by, their faces alternating between horror at what might have happened and pride in their son's actions. Captain Lawrence of the State Police approached Margaret, notepad in hand. "Ms. Wilson, we've got most of your statement, but I need to clarify a few details before we wrap up here." Margaret nodded, wincing at the movement. "Of course. We've arrested Commissioner Hargrove, Sheriff Holloway, and 3 of the 5 robbers. The other 2 brothers, apparently, are still at large, but we have descriptions and vehicle information. It's just a matter of time." He flipped through his notes. "What I'm struggling with is the nail gun. You disabled 5 armed men with a construction tool." Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling. "I've been selling tools for 25 years, Captain. I know what they can do." Lawrence shook his head in amazement. "Well, the security footage confirms your account. Speaking of which," he produced a small flash drive from his pocket. "This was recovered from the store system. Thought you might want a copy for safekeeping." The video evidence, capturing everything from the initial break-in to the final confrontation, had already become the talk of law enforcement circles. An officer had connected the system to a laptop, and Margaret had watched portions during her statement, seeing her own actions from an outside perspective for the first time. "Thank you," she said, pocketing the drive. It felt strange to possess a recording of the most harrowing night of her life, like holding a physical manifestation of trauma and triumph. As the morning progressed, Cedar Ridge residents gathered behind the police barriers, murmuring among themselves as details spread through the community's efficient grapevine. Margaret recognized familiar faces: customers, neighbors, friends, their expressions ranging from shock to concern to admiration. Hank and Fran pushed through the crowd, Hank leaning heavily on his cane as they approached the ambulance. "My God, Maggie," Fran gasped, taking in Margaret's injuries. "When we heard." "I'm all right," Margaret assured them, accepting Fran's careful hug. "The store took the worst of it." "To hell with the store," Hank growled, uncharacteristic emotion thickening his voice. "Buildings can be fixed. You're what matters." By mid-morning, Margaret's children had arrived. Thomas flying in from Seattle, Sarah driving frantically from Springfield with her husband and twins. The family reunion happened under the incongruous setting of police lights and crime scene tape, tears and tight embraces exchanged in full view of curious onlookers. "Mom, you could have been killed," Sarah said, inspecting her mother's injuries with a nurse's practiced eye. "But I wasn't," Margaret replied simply, "and neither was Jessie." As her family fussed around her, Margaret watched a police technician exit the store carrying her original weapon, the pneumatic nail gun, now sealed in an evidence bag. The sight triggered a cascade of memories from the previous night. The first desperate shot, the strategic planning, the final confrontation. Each nail a decision to survive rather than surrender. A commotion near the police barrier drew her attention. A reporter had set up for a live broadcast, camera aimed at the hardware store with Margaret visible in the background. "We're here at Cedar Ridge Hardware," the reporter announced, where last night, 58-year-old store manager Margaret Wilson fended off 5 armed robbers using only a nail gun. Sources tell us this incredible act of self-defense uncovered a corruption scheme involving local officials. Margaret turned away from the cameras, uncomfortable with the attention. This wasn't how she had imagined her store appearing on television. Captain Lawrence approached again, his expression more relaxed. "Ms. Wilson, we've completed the initial documentation. The insurance investigators will need access next, but we can let you briefly enter to assess the damage if you'd like." Supported by Thomas and Sarah, Margaret crossed the threshold of her store for the first time since the dramatic escape hours earlier. Daylight revealed the full extent of the previous night's chaos. Broken displays, scattered merchandise, bloodstains on the worn wooden floor. Evidence markers dotted the scene, numbering each significant item for the investigation. "It looks worse than it is," she said, more to convince herself than her children. "Most of this is just cleanup and reorganization." As they walked carefully through the space, Margaret noticed a small crowd had gathered outside the shattered front door. Word had spread rapidly through town, and more people arrived by the minute, many carrying coffee cups from the diner down the street. When Margaret emerged from the store, spontaneous applause erupted from the gathered crowd. Startled, she stopped, leaning more heavily on Thomas's arm. Old Pete Jenkins called out from the front of the group, "Cedar Ridge stands with you, Maggie." Others joined in with offers of help, expressions of support, and declarations of loyalty. The diner owner promised free meals for workers helping with repairs. The florist pledged arrangements for the reopening. The high school woodshop teacher volunteered his students to rebuild display cases. As the community's response washed over her, Margaret felt something tight within her chest begin to loosen. The hardware store had always been more than a business. It was a cornerstone of Cedar Ridge, a gathering place, a resource. Now, in its moment of crisis, the community was rallying to protect one of its own. A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. "Ms. Wilson, people are already calling you the nail gun grandma online. The security footage has gone viral. How does it feel to become an overnight sensation?" Margaret blinked, the question so disconnected from her reality that she almost laughed. "I'm just a hardware store manager who did what was necessary. There's nothing sensational about wanting to survive." But as cameras flashed and more questions flew, Margaret realized that her private struggle had become a public narrative, one already spreading beyond her control. 3 weeks after the night that transformed Cedar Ridge hardware from local business to national news story, Margaret stood behind the newly rebuilt counter, watching the morning sunlight stream through repaired windows. The physical restoration had happened with remarkable speed, a community-wide effort that brought volunteers from throughout the county. What had begun as cleanup evolved into a complete renovation, with donations of materials and labor pouring in from businesses and individuals alike. The brass bell above the door chimed as Jesse entered, now working full-time during his gap semester. The trauma had shifted his educational plans, but not in the way tragedy typically might. Instead of withdrawing, he'd embraced a newfound purpose. "Morning, Ms. Wilson," he called, hanging his jacket on the new coat rack. "Ready for the grand reopening tomorrow?" "As ready as we'll ever be." Margaret adjusted the framed document that now held a place of honor beside Robert's photograph. Her newly reinstated pistol license, properly issued with apologies from the State Firearms Division. The license represented more than legal permission to carry a firearm. It symbolized the restoration of her dignity and security after both had been deliberately stripped away. The criminal case had progressed with unusual efficiency. Commissioner Hargrove faced multiple felony charges including conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, corruption, and racketeering. His financial records revealed a complex web of illegal activities stretching back years. The Cedar Ridge Plaza development was merely the latest in a series of projects built on intimidation and corruption. Dan Holloway had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Hargrove and others in the criminal enterprise. His cooperation had exposed 3 other corrupt officials in neighboring counties. The betrayal still stung, but Margaret had declined to speak with him despite his requests. Some breaches couldn't be mended with apologies. The media attention had gradually subsided, though nail gun grandma merchandise continued to appear online. Margaret had refused all interview requests and declined book deals, preferring to focus on rebuilding rather than reliving the experience for public consumption. The store phone rang, a common occurrence as word of the reopening spread. Margaret answered with her standard greeting, "Cedar Ridge Hardware, this is Margaret." "Ms. Wilson, this is Carol Hemphill from Sterling Security Systems," came the response. "I'm calling to confirm your installation appointment for tomorrow morning." "Yes, 9 o'clock, Margaret confirmed. Before the reopening ceremony. The new security system, a donation from a national manufacturer who recognized good publicity when they saw it, represented one of many changes to the store. Some were visible, like the reinforced doors and upgraded lighting. Others remained hidden, like the panic buttons now installed throughout the building and the safe room created in the renovated basement. As she hung up, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the newly installed security mirror. The physical bruises had faded, though occasional nightmares remained. Her hair seemed to carry more silver than before, but her eyes held something new, a steely resilience forged in crisis. Jesse approached, carrying the final inventory clipboard. All sections accounted for, were fully stocked and organized. Thank you. Margaret took the clipboard, checking the numbers with practiced efficiency. Hard to believe we did in 3 weeks what normally takes months. People wanted to help. You're kind of a local hero. Margaret shook her head, still uncomfortable with the designation. I just did what anyone would do to survive. Not anyone, Jessie countered with the directness of youth. Most people would have surrendered. You fought back. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, neighbors dropping off baked goods, well-wishers offering encouragement, and customers asking when they could resume shopping. Each conversation reinforced what Margaret had always known but now understood more deeply. Cedar Ridge Hardware wasn't just her livelihood. It was part of the community's foundation. As evening approached and Jessie left for his economics class, Margaret performed her closing routine with meticulous care. The register balanced perfectly. The new security system armed with a satisfying beep. The inventory clipboard showed everything in its proper place. At the front door, she paused, hand resting briefly on the space beneath the counter where her revolver now legally resided once more. The weight of the past 3 weeks, the violence, the betrayal, the recovery, settled around her shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy but necessary. Margaret Wilson locked the door of Cedar Ridge Hardware and stepped into the cool evening air. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter in a story she hadn't chosen but had somehow managed to survive and reshape. Some things had changed irreversibly. Others remained steadfast. Both would be needed for whatever came next.